All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Brett. Super excited to be here and talk to everybody today. Like Brett said, I love questions. So as I'm going through this, be sure to put your questions in chat and I'll be sure to answer them at the end. We've got some time set aside at the end to specifically take and answer questions. So super excited about that. So yeah, like Brett said, today I'm going to be covering a deep dive into how you can use the data at your fingertips today to start to address some of the issues and challenges around instruments, specifically missing instruments at facilities. So first up, a little bit of background on myself. I work at Census Technologies. I started here in the summer of 2003. Most of that time, I wrote code for Census. So I was writing the code for our SensaTrack application. Since then, they asked me to lead one of our development teams. And today, like Brett said, I lead the innovation team here at Census. So our job, our mission is specifically to go out, talk to customers, understand what their biggest challenges are, and then examine new technologies, new solutions, and new ideas, and understand if those new solutions can help solve some of these old problems that hospitals have today. So about 2 years ago, we started with that innovation team, and we started talking to our customers, specifically in sterile processing, and asking, if you had a genie in a lamp, and you could ask that genie for perfect data. I know that seems fantastic, but if you could get perfect data about anything in your environment, anything in sterile processing, up to the OR and back again, what are the kinds of problems that you would solve with that information? And like I said, it does seem fantastic, but the point is we wanted to understand where data could make a difference for our customers. And we got lots of responses, as you can imagine. But you could kind of divide those responses into 4 major problem sets. We started this in 2021, so we were still coming out of the pandemic at that time. And so I think the number 1 response we got was really around staffing and productivity. As everybody here knows, it's been difficult to staff a sterile processing department for as long as I can remember anyway. I'm sure it goes back a long, long way. But it definitely got harder after the pandemic. So that was top of everybody's mind. On top of that, people were concerned about the quality of the trays that were being sent up to the OR. That is something that every department has to continually work at. And that has an intersection with productivity and staffing. At least in our minds, we thought, well, if you push people to go faster, they're going to make more mistakes. And so at some point, there had to be some trade-off or interaction between the productivity in the department and the quality of the trays that were being sent up to the OR. The third major problem set that everybody identified was around the cost of instrumentation. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. So it's very normal for sterile processing departments to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars every year replacing lost instrumentation. And then that's a frustration for the OR as well. When they get a tray up and it's missing instruments, that causes problems. That makes surgeons less happy, and ultimately that means that the patient isn't getting the highest standard of care. So it's really important to try and solve these issues, to understand why are instruments going missing. How can we use the data that we collect today with our instrument tracking systems to identify, root cause for some of this stuff, or even just a baseline for where we're at today. So that was really our mandate. So just very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of data that we collect with modern instrument tracking systems, in case anybody on this session doesn't have an instrument tracking system at their facility. So broadly, instrument tracking systems are asset management systems for sterile processing. We put barcodes on everything and then scan those barcodes to track the assets through each step of the process. So that's really when things come down from the OR and they hit decon, we're tracking them through the decon process into the washers. As they come out of the washers, we're tracking what's going and getting assembled. We track and collect data about sterilization. So as you put the trays into the sterilizer, you're scanning those into the sterilizer, and your modern instrument tracking systems are collecting not just what assets you have, where they are, but who's processing them, how long did it take to process those trays, and then the conditions of those trays. So specifically, when the trays are being assembled, the technician has an opportunity at that point to say something about the condition of that tray. Typically, they're going to list, here are the things that are currently in the tray or being assembled into the tray. There's different ways that the various instrument tracking systems collect that data, but that's common to all of them. So if an instrument is missing from the tray, that's the first point where you're going to be able to collect that information. When we look at the data that we had available, we can see a couple of things in the instrument tracking system. So first, you can see for any given tray, for any given assembly, here are the things that the technician said were in the tray. Here are the things that the technician said were missing from the tray. We can also look at previous assemblies for that same tray because that data is collected continually. So that was really the genesis for the idea here. We got data today and historical data about what was being assembled into trays over some period of time. Most instrument tracking systems can interact with your OR schedule as well to prioritize workflow, figure out what trays are needed for upcoming cases to assist with case picking. So we have data at our fingertips about how those trays are being used, where they were used previously. So it seemed like when we started in on this project that we had all of the fundamental pieces necessary to understand root cause for where things are getting lost. So a little bit about instrument tracking systems and using that data for analytics. So we had already had some success using data to produce analytics to help customers solve problems. Like I said, the first two problem sets that were top of everybody's mind were around staffing and productivity and quality of the trays. And it's not enough to just, plot out, well, what did everybody do every day? How many issues have we had with trays? The power of analytics is really helping you get beneath that surface level information and understand, root causes behind things, common patterns. You want, some sort of actionable insight where you can say, okay, if I change this, it's going to make the world better in this way. And here's how I know that that's the case. So as an example for when we started looking at staffing and productivity challenges, one of the things that we learned was that there is a direct correlation, and this won't come as a shock to anybody who works in sterile processing, but because I don't work in sterile processing, this came as an insight to me. There is a direct correlation between the number of instruments you put in a tray and how long it takes to process that tray, right? Makes perfect sense. If you double the number of instruments in a tray, it's going to take twice as long to clean everything. It's going to take twice as long to assemble that into a tray. That said, we found that many of our customers were staffing their department based on the number of trays that they were able to process in a given time period. So when we looked at two otherwise similar hospitals, one of the things we found is that they needed different levels of staff in order to process the same number of trays because they had different numbers of instruments in those trays. As an example, we were working with a customer on the East Coast. They had two hospitals that rolled up into the same system. This system had said, okay, we're gonna staff a certain number of FTEs based on how many trays you process every day. At facility A, that metric that they'd come up with worked very well. They were able to turn all the trays they needed to every day. They didn't have a lot of stuff down at the start of first shift. Facility B, no matter what they tried, they couldn't get everything turned at the end of the day. It was a real problem. They tried moving people around. They tried looking at, the workflow and, streamlining things and adding more assembly stations or adding more sinks in the decon area to try and get those trays turned faster. And nothing seemed to work. And when we looked at their data in analytics, we were able to see that they had 50% more instruments on average in their trays at this facility. So they were, in essence, asking their staff to do 50% more work at facility B than at facility A. And so that's really the power of analytics. It lets you kind of get beneath the surface, understand those correlations and those insights. And we wanted to leverage that same concept here with the instrument data. Another really good example of this is when we looked at the quality of the trays. So modern tracking systems enable you to track defects associated with trays. If a tray is sent up to the OR, the nurse finds, let's say, that there's no indicator in the tray. They can report that. That can be tracked as a defect. You can take that information and figure out, well, who assembled this tray and therefore who's responsible, and so on and so forth. When we started looking at, in aggregate, the defect rates for trays, for technicians, for facilities, one of the things we found is that didn't correlate with productivity in the way we thought. Our original idea was that, or our hypothesis was that, if you push people to go faster, they're going to make more mistakes. But what we found is that's not the way the real world actually works. So it is true that when people rush, they make more mistakes. That's absolutely the case. But it wasn't the case that most managers are standing in the department with a stopwatch, just pushing people to go faster, faster, faster all the time. By looking at the data and bringing that into analytics, what we were able to see is that people would rush when they got behind, right? If you work in sterile processing, that doesn't come as a shock. But being able to see that in the data was extremely insightful and helpful for those conversations with the OR to help them understand what was going on. So one of the things we found is that at facilities where they had been able to reduce the number of instruments and trays, or in other ways focus their productivity so they could turn more trays, they didn't get behind as often as other facilities. And because they didn't get behind, they didn't have as many days where staff were rushing and making mistakes. So it turned out that there is actually a positive interaction between staffing and productivity and quality. The other thing that was really, really cool to see in the data was that as technicians became more proficient and learned the instrumentation, they made fewer mistakes. Not something that came as a shock to anybody, but being able to see that and measure that was huge. What we could see is that there is a 3 to 5 times difference between somebody who's brand new to sterile processing and somebody who's been in the department for a year. It really underscored with data for our customers how much people matter. And on top of that, how much the investment that a hospital makes in their technicians matters. So it's super important to help technicians grow and learn the instrumentation. And with the analytics, you can see where somebody is with data along that journey and put together, effective coaching and education plans and growth plans for those individuals. And what you know with data now is how that's going to benefit not just your department, but ultimately the patient, right? So that's really the promise of analytics here, is not just to put up on a chart, here's what we did today. It's to use that data to get beneath the surface and understand those insights to help actually improve the world. So with that, let's move to the next slide here. So what we wanted to do here is a couple of things. One, we wanted to start to measure some kind of a baseline. If we're going to tackle missing instruments, we need to understand, what does the world look like today? So the two key metrics we want to look at are tray completion rates and missing instrument rates. So that's your tray completion rate is for all the trays that you send up to the OR, what percentage of those trays are missing at least one instrument? For missing instrument rates, we want to know what percentage of all the instruments within those trays that are going up to the OR are listed as missing. And we want to look at a trend of these two metrics over time to understand if things are getting better or if they're getting worse. So that's kind of your baseline. At the end of the day, if we can improve either of those metrics, it's going to end up benefiting the hospital, the surgeons, and the patients, right? So if, let's say today, 80% of the trays go up 100% complete, if we can move that to 90 or 95%, that's going to make a really big difference. Also, with the missing instrument rates, that's telling us, for any given month or any given period of time, how many instruments am I going to have to replace? So there's your cost savings for the facility. If, let's say, 2% of all instruments go missing every month, that's huge, right? So maybe we can cut that to 0.25% or lower, and dramatically reduce the cost of running a sterile processing department. So that's the first thing. Let's understand the baseline. So in our tracking systems today, like I said, we got that information already. Most modern tracking systems have reporting components that'll let you view this information, export this information to tools like Excel, start to pull these into your common analytics tools if you have them, things like Tableau or Power BI. Widely available, fantastic analytics solutions today. Or just manually, looking at the data, you can pull this into Excel and chart it. Most tracking systems also have some ability to do this as well. So then the next thing is really the holy grail. Can we get to root causes for instruments going missing? So in our case, we went and interviewed lots and lots of customers to start to understand, at least anecdotally, how do these instruments go missing? Won't come as a shock to anybody that works in sterile processing, but what we uncovered is the instruments aren't going missing while the tray is closed, right? The instruments go missing when the tray gets opened, which is in the OR. So anecdotes we got are things like, clips and clamps and stuff like that gets wrapped up in the drapes and thrown away. We talked to a number of customers that tried over the years solutions like putting metal detectors on trash cans, scanning, using a metal detector wand to scan the trash to see if anything was thrown away. Challenges they ran into that are things like there are metal things that legitimately go in that trash, and so that would set off the metal detectors and stuff like that. But that's one way they go missing. We found out that for whatever reason, residents like to borrow instruments. I'm not sure even now exactly why that is, but residents tend to borrow a lot of instruments. Interesting story, here at Census, our claim to fame years and years ago was putting essentially barcodes on the instruments, little marks, so we could actually identify them. And I can remember, this was probably 2004, 2005. We were implementing for a brand new customer in Nashville. And as we were marking their instruments, we came across an instrument that already had a mark on it, and it was one of ours. And so we scanned it in our system, and we found out that it came from a completely unrelated hospital across town, not even part of the same IDN. We never did learn exactly how it came from hospital A to hospital B, but our leading hypothesis was that it was a resident that had borrowed that instrument and then, gone and worked at this other hospital and left it behind somehow. So that instrument managed to not just grow legs, but, I don't know, catch a bus across town to go to another hospital. So that was kind of a neat find. And we've seen that a couple of times since. So yeah, that's another way things go missing. I'm always surprised when I talk to customers about the stories they have behind instruments going missing. The first time I heard a story about somebody going dumpster diving, I thought, this has got to be, a story I'm never going to hear again. Somebody told me about, somebody threw away a drill. And so somebody in SPD had to go out and do some dumpster diving to try and get that drill back because it cost something like $10,000. But I've heard that particular story over and over again from lots of hospitals. So just sometimes I think, in the rush to turn over rooms or in the rush to get the patient what they need, things end up in the trash. The other leading cause of instruments going missing that we heard is instruments getting mixed up between trays. So this happens, at the end of the procedure. They're getting ready to turn the room over. Normally, the scrub tech is responsible for putting the instruments from the procedure back in the trays they came from, and if they do that, that's great. It makes it a lot easier to process those trays and get them reassembled back in sterile processing. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes they'll mix some of the instrumentation up. And when that happens, sometimes you'll get, a technician in sterile processing that's assembling the tray. They find extra stuff that doesn't belong in that tray. And sometimes that stuff ends up in a drawer. I was visiting a customer back in the fall, and this was a customer that processed trays for a couple of different facilities within that city. So they had an off-site reprocessing center. So a lot of trays were running through this facility, and they had these big drawers on wheels. Looks like a giant tool cabinet or something like that. And they had 5 or 6 of these things, and they were just filled with instruments that had gotten mixed up between trays, and they had collected and were actively working to try and get them back in the trays they belonged in. But just due to the volume of trays that they were processing and, the normal pressures of running sterile processing and getting things turned quickly, they hadn't been able to do that. They also had collected instruments and started to organize them on a pegboard that was probably about 40 or 50 feet long. So huge operation here. But that just, kind of shows the magnitude of this challenge. And then the last story that we heard, about things going missing was when an instrument looks like it's disposable, but it's not. I was very surprised by this one as well, because I don't work in sterile processing, that you very often get disposable instruments from manufacturers, and the disposable and the non-disposable look similar. We heard lots and lots of stories about, you'll get a traveler in the OR, and they'll come from a facility where this thing is disposable, and at your facility you don't have the disposable version, and they just think, oh, I'm supposed to throw this away, and so they do. And so stuff goes missing that way. So to get to root causes, what we want to do is we want to look at, instruments that are reported as missing during that assembly step, and walk back to which operating room they were most recently used in, which surgeon was in that room, who was the scrub tech in that room. And it's not always going to be the case that the OR room was responsible for any one instrument going missing. But in aggregate, what we should see is differences between the different operating rooms, different surgeons, and different scrub techs. If it is indeed the case at your facility that you've got a scrub tech that's throwing things away that shouldn't be thrown away, you should see a higher missing rate from that room, right? So we want to start tracking back to root cause here. And then once you can understand root cause, understand, what's going missing and why, then you can start to develop strategies and countermeasures, and start looking at sustainment for those countermeasures. And you want to evaluate the the cost of those various countermeasures. So that's the last data point we want to look at. What are the countermeasures you can deploy? How effective are those countermeasures, and can that that savings be sustained over an extended period of time? You can imagine, one of the countermeasures being, going and doing an in-service with the staff and saying, hey, this thing is not disposable. Please don't throw it away, right? But, 2 months later, 6 months later, there's some turnover in the OR, you may be right back at that problem. So it's really important to, deploy the countermeasure, measure the impact, and then watch that impact over time. Because if that impact starts to fade, you'll want to go back and maybe redeploy. So that's the kind of data we want to start to collect. And then we want to analyze the trends. So what we're looking at here is some fake data, but this is one way you can look at the first two KPIs, which is your tray completion rate and your overall missing instrument rate. So here what we've done is we plotted the tray completion rate, that's that blue line across the top, for a fictitious facility, to start to understand what's going on. What you can see here is that, they started off a couple of years ago with something like 10 or 12% of their trays going up missing something, which isn't too bad. And it grew by like 50%. Over the course of those years. So they've got a trend that's worsening. So definitely a case where you want to dig in beneath the surface and start to understand root causes and why. Interestingly, at the bottom, and this is something we tend to see a lot, even though this is fake data, this is very much the kind of information that we uncover when we look at customer data. The total percentage of instruments that are missing on any given day is more or less flat. I mean, there's been some increase over the same period of time, but not nearly as much as what you see in terms of the missing instrument trend. So it's like here you've got the same number of instruments missing, but they're going from a concentrated set of trays to a larger number of trays over this period of time. So that can be something as well that's really interesting to understand. When you deploy countermeasures, these are the same statistics that you want to track. So once you understand root cause, where things are going missing, why they're going missing, develop countermeasures, deploy those, then you should see these numbers improve. So next, we want to understand what are the root causes. Go to the next slide here. So like I said, there's a number of different things that could be a root cause. Like I said, it could be stuff getting wrapped up and thrown away. It could be, things that look like they're disposable, but not disposable getting thrown away. It could be instruments getting mixed up between trays. All of those are things that happen in the OR. So it's extremely helpful if you can show trends by operating room or by surgeon. Also by day of week and time of day turn out to be really important trends to look at. One of the things that we discovered that came as a shock to me is that for many hospitals, if you look at the time of day when a case happens where an instrument goes missing, a disproportionate number of those instruments are going missing around lunchtime. Which I thought was really strange, and started asking our customers, what do you think about this? Why is this going on? And a lot of them said, oh yeah, I know what's going on there. That's shift change or lunches, right? So you've got a scrub tech that starts the procedure, and then somebody comes in to give them their lunch, and that person finishes the procedure. Well, the person finishing the procedure, walks in, instruments are already out, right? On the back table, they're on the Mayo stand. And they don't necessarily know where those instruments go. So it's much more likely at that time that they're going to put them back in the wrong tray. And also they may not be as familiar with that particular procedure. They may, be somebody that normally does a different procedure. And so now they're giving lunch to this person over here, not as familiar. So they just don't know which tray they ought to go back in. So that was, something like I said, came as a shock to me. or a surprise to me. But yeah, so here, like in a perfect world, everybody would have about the same rate of missing instruments. In the real world, that's never the case. I'm not sure why yet, but it seems like at many hospitals, it's the ortho rooms where they tend to lose a lot more stuff. I don't know what goes on in there, but just to pick on ortho, it does seem like that they tend to have higher missing rates. And that's not just higher numbers of missing instruments. That's like percentage of overall instruments that are going through there are going missing. It is true that there are a lot of ortho procedures that have a lot of instruments involved. So there tends to be a huge opportunity there with those ortho cases. And then looking at it by surgeon can be super helpful. It may not necessarily be anything that the surgeon is doing, but it may be the kinds of things that that surgeon is asking for. This is one of those cases where, if surgeons are asking for lots of instruments that never get used, finding ways to optimize those trays and reduce the number of instruments in those trays, like it has such a huge impact in terms of productivity, but it's also going to have an impact in terms of the number of instruments that go missing as well. So if you think about, when you open a tray, let's say there's 100 instruments in there. For each instrument, there is some percent chance that that instrument goes missing during that procedure. So the more instruments you have, the more instruments will statistically over time go missing, right? Another way to think about it is, and this is not realistic, but hypothetically, if every procedure could be performed with just one instrument, the number of instruments that go missing would be tremendously low because there's only one instrument involved, right? So the more instruments you have involved, the more instruments will ultimately go missing. So that's another thing that's driving this and really good to measure. So yeah, that's one set of root causes. The other root causes that are really important to look at are, what's actually going missing. You won't be surprised by some of this. It's a lot of clamps and clips and things like that. Like I said, anecdotally, we already knew that those tend to get wrapped up in the drapes and thrown away. People have been saying that for years. Being able to actually measure that is really important. If you're working in sterile processing and you're having to replace a lot of these, you might go to the OR and say, hey, look, these things keep coming down missing. And the OR is going to say, yeah, that's great. What do you want me to do about it? That's kind of your problem. You guys need to figure out how to get us the instruments we need. But if you can go to the OR and you can say, okay, OR room number 13 is throwing away lots of clamps. These specific clamps, and it's these procedures, this doctor, this time of day. Now you've got data to have a conversation with, especially if you can say, hey, if we can raise awareness about this particular issue, we can reduce the number of instruments that ultimately go missing. We can trend that and we can show you an improvement as a result. And as a result, you're more likely to get the stuff you need the next time around. If it goes missing today, there's a chance I won't be able to send that up to you tomorrow. So if we can raise awareness about this, and by the way, we can actually measure it and see an improvement, that's a much easier conversation to have. And it doesn't require the OR to do anything drastically different, right? It's a matter of having conversation with the staff, giving them visibility to the metrics in some way. And it doesn't have to be, through software. It can be as simple as just posting the key metric for that OR room in a common area, or presenting that during, the daily stand-up at the beginning of the shift. But making people aware of, the problem with data, being able to have the conversation with the OR with data is far more effective than just saying, hey, here's a problem we have. It works the other way around too, right? Like if you have a service line that, is complaining about the condition of trays, we're always missing instruments from these trays. Well, okay, that's great, but if you don't know which trays and which days they were missing, it's very difficult to actually do something about it. And then even if you do, you're dealing with perception at that point. You're not dealing with data. So being able to say, okay, you're missing instruments, great. Let's target those trays. Let's fill what's missing from those trays today, and then track that over time. Look at what keeps coming down missing from your service line or your OR rooms. Then we can talk about this problem with data. We can develop data-driven solutions to this problem, right? And then you have a partnership and a collaboration and not finger pointing. So super important to get to root cause, and root cause with data, because that's key and foundational to those countermeasures. So the last thing that's really important to measure is the impact that your department makes. So one of the things that modern instrument tracking systems can track is not just which instruments are marked as missing, but what countermeasures are technicians taking. So if you think about it, if you were to tell technicians, okay, I'm going to evaluate your performance based on how many trays you assemble every day. I want you to assemble, I'm just going to pick a number, 20 trays every day, right? That technician is assembling trays and they find out, oh, this tray is missing a number 3 knife handle. It's got 4 in there normally, but I only have 3. What should I do? If they're only being evaluated based on the number of trays that they assemble, that technician may go, oh, well, I know the OR is going to be fine without this. I'm just going to mark it as missing, close everything up, and send it up, right? And so accidentally, we've created the wrong incentive here. If that technician gets credit for going and finding that instrument amongst other trays, or going and pulling it from backstock or the pegboard or wherever they can get another number 3 knife handle, then they're incentivized to complete that tray 100%. And it's much more likely that that tray is going to be completed. It's much more likely that they're going to find that instrument if it got mixed up with another tray, and end up not going into a drawer and costing the facility money. And one knife handle isn't that expensive, but this is a problem that happens all day, every day with thousands and thousands of instruments. So in the aggregate, that's hugely impactful for the facility and ultimately for the patient, right? So one of the things you definitely want to do is measure that, be transparent about that, both with the technicians and with the OR. So if you can say, okay, technicians are assembling almost all of the trays to 100% completion. That's great, but it's taking us 7 hours a week extra time to do that because they're having to go and sift through this tray or that tray to find missing instruments. And by the way, we can break that down by service or by tray. Now you can go back to the OR room and say, look, we've got a scrub tech in this room that consistently mixes things up between trays. And as a result, here's the very real impact that has on our productivity. It's essentially an extra person every week just sorting these instruments out. If we put stuff back in the right trays, we're going to be able to turn things faster. They're going to be in better condition. It's much more likely that you're going to get what you need next time around. Like I said, ultimately, the patient is going to benefit from this. So super helpful if you can measure this because it incentivizes the technicians to do the right thing because now they know, hey, if I do this and I do the right thing, I'm going to get credit for it. And technicians want to do the right thing, right? But it's very helpful if they know that they're going to get credit for doing it as well, right? And then the second thing is being able to show that cost savings because of the technician's efforts and the cost of those efforts to the facility helps to have that data-driven conversation with the OR. And especially if you can do it in a targeted way. It's this tray that's a problem, or it's this service line, or this OR room where the problem originates. So going back and, showing how that interacts with the different OR rooms, super, super helpful. The other thing that you can measure is how many instruments are you having to pull from backstock or a pegboard to fill in holes coming down in trays. So what is the remaining opportunity ahead of you? So you can, add up or estimate the cost for all of those instruments. You can then look at that cost by service line, by tray, by kind of instrument. So if you see a lot of a certain kind of instrument, maybe an Adson forceps or something like that going missing, that can tell you right away what the root cause is. That might be something that looks like it's disposable, for example, or the service line. Oh, we've got a traveler in that room who's, just arrived last week. We need to do an in-service and talk to them about our processes, procedures, and so on and so forth, right? And make sure that they're following the process. So all kinds of, actions that can be taken if you can collect and analyze this kind of data. Last but not least, sometimes you'll get an instrument down and that instrument needs to go out for maintenance for some reason, right? So you might mark that on this assembly as being missing, but it's missing because you had to send this thing out to have it sharpened or have the inserts replaced or something like that. That's not a missing instrument that went missing because of something that happened in the OR. Well, at least they didn't throw it away anyway, right? So that you want to collect that as well so that you can separate that information out and get closer to a true missing instrument rate for things that actually went missing in the OR. So taken in the aggregate, you want to, look at your baseline data, get to root cause, and then start to measure the impact and the cost of those countermeasures. Talking about strategies, like I said, having data to have data-driven conversations is super, super important. And we see this on both sides, right? Like when somebody, consistently complains, but they don't give a lot of information about what the actual pain is. It's very difficult to countermeasure that, right? Having looked at quality defects, for example, for many years, sometimes we'll see, a nurse will say, had a problem with one of the trays, right? Okay, well, that's great. Which tray was it? What was the procedure? What was the problem you had with the tray? I can't do anything with just that piece of information. So collecting accurate data about the problem, what happened, when did it happen, all the relevant context, being able to do that in an automated way, and then put that into an analytics platform to analyze it, gives you the ability to have those data-driven countermeasures, right? So you can say, okay, here's our current missing instrument rate. Here's the OR room that has the highest missing instrument rate. Here are the top 3 instruments that go missing from that room. Let's go do an in-service and raise awareness about these things. When you see which instruments those are, it's probably going to be obvious why they're going missing. And if it's not, the next step is to talk to the scrub techs, the nurses that work in that room, and they're going to have the insight. Definitely, they might say, "Oh, it's the doctor keeps pocketing this instrument," or "Oh, yeah, that's something that at the end of this procedure accidentally gets wrapped up and thrown in the trash." All that kind of stuff, right? And having that transparency and that accountability gives you the platform you need in order to drive improvement. So being able to say, okay, this is the kind of stuff that was missing last week, and then let's track that over the next month, 2 months, 6 months, and here's a target we want to get to. We think this is reasonable. And then being able to do that. You have to have the data in order to do that, right? So then 6 months later, you're not talking about just perceptions. Oh, we feel like a lot of clips and clamps are being thrown away. We can say, hey, we've been able to reduce the number of clips and clamps that get thrown away in this OR room from here down to here, and that's huge. And then everybody gets credit for it. The hospital ends up saving money. The patients get a higher standard of care because they're more likely to have what they need. And the surgeons are ultimately going to be happier about all this. And everybody loves a happy surgeon, right? And then last, you want to track that stuff like I said, for 3 months, 6 months, a year, and make sure that that's sustained. It's very easy to go in and raise awareness and get some kind of reaction in the short term, see some improvement, and then 6 months later find out you're right back where you were. So continuing to present that information, weekly, monthly, daily, make sure everybody's aware of it, will drive sustainment for these countermeasures. All right, so that was lots and lots of information. Would love to open it up to Q&A. If you've got questions, please put them in chat. I think Brett's going to MC for me here, and we'll try to answer these.
Yeah, Seamus, that was really good. And I always, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to data and numbers, because what it does is it opens up the conversation, right? It gives you the backbone to go to a surgeon and say, this is the reason why we need to do this. It opens up the communication streams between sterile processing and the OR. And ultimately, I believe Marty said this at a couple sessions ago, is data supports action, right? It's, people are the ones behind this, but it's the people behind the numbers. And so when you have that, you really can support action, corrective action, to really fix these issues. So, really great. We do have a question here from Warren, and then I've got a few we can throw at you. But what percentage do you find facilities using a tracking system within the OR suite?
Yeah, within the OR, it's pretty low, right? We do have some customers where nurses use the tracking system directly, but I'd say they're the exception and not the rule. It's mostly sterile processing that uses it. I think that's another challenge that we're working on, not necessarily to get nurses to use the tracking system, but it creates some blind spots, right? So, one of the pains we hear about over the years is, nurses will come and grab things off case carts. They don't tell anybody, right? And so SPD doesn't know that there's something that needs to be replenished on a case cart until, right before the procedure happens, which is the worst time to find out about it. So I would say it's not the majority. When it comes to getting quality feedback from nurses, the most effective ways that we've seen is just to have the nurses write things on the count sheets. So a lot of our customers will put a section on their count sheet for feedback, and then the nurse can write on it, and then those get collected and entered into the system down in sterile processing. There are ways with most systems to do that very, very quickly. But I think that answers the question.
Yeah. Great answer. Yeah. And, I think one of the things I was thinking about too is we are living in the modern age, right? We've got all these tracking systems and a lot of good ways to collect data to identify issues. But there are also facilities out there that may not have the budget, that may have a little trepidation as far as adopting a tracking system. It's a whole new process. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of solely relying on a manual tracking process?
Well, yeah, as it relates to this, this is data that's absolutely impossible to get. It's not impossible, but it's completely impractical to get on a manual basis. You can imagine trying to track, so if customers don't have a system, if you think about olden times, you've got, printed off forms that, tell you what goes in every tray. You assemble the trays, but you don't collect any data about what actually happens during that process. Not in an automated fashion anyway. So you don't know from assembly to assembly what was in there, what wasn't in there. You don't know who did it necessarily or how long it took. You don't know anything about the defects that were found or reported. You don't know anything about repair trends over time for your instrumentation. So there's just so many problems that are impossible to solve without that data. Just some basic things like, it's not uncommon for instruments to be damaged because of the way they're used in the operating room. We've heard dozens and dozens of stories about, surgeons damaging rigid scopes because they're using them in the wrong way. But if you don't have data to show that, then you're never going to be able to have a conversation with a surgeon and tell him he's doing his job wrong, right? That's absolutely impossible.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, when you start to collect this data and analyze the data, there are so many problems that you can solve with this data because you can have a data-driven conversation. It's like they say, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. When you talk from facts, there's no room for I feel like, right? So it really just brings clarity to the entire situation. Yeah, good question.
Right. Yeah, and as you pointed out, it identifies root cause. Time of day. Say it's a Monday or Wednesday, it's a different surgeon, same surgical procedure, but it's happening more frequently on a Monday or on a Friday. Whichever, you can really dig into that data to identify those solutions and be like, we're missing more instruments on a given day at this time. And, you mentioned you don't want to tell a surgeon that they're doing their job wrong, but you can also say, hey, these instruments are missing a lot during your procedures.
Right.
And, really go from there. Speaking about those, instrumentation, as not all instruments are used in surgical cases, and oftentimes are based on surgeon preference or because it's just the way it is and what the case specifies. It's just how it's been done. But do you have any examples of success stories where data has helped minimize inventory and tray counts relative to the procedure, so it really cuts the work on the back end?
Yeah, it's a good question. That was a big focus of the work we did when we were examining productivity. Like I said, there is a direct correlation between the number of instruments in a tray and how long it takes to process that tray. And so we did do a lot of work to try and figure out, well, which trays are ripe for us optimization of some kind. And how do you know? Like, it takes a lot of calories. You burn a lot of calories to optimize a tray because you got to go and work with the OR. You got to talk to the scrub techs and figure out, well, what does the doc use, all the time? What does the doc use sometimes? What does the doc use never? And there's products out there that can help you with that, for sure. But at the end of the day, you're going to burn a lot of calories doing that. So how do you know how to target those calories in an effective way? And so what we did is we looked at, for any given tray, how often is this tray turned? How many copies of this tray do you have? And how big is this tray? And so if you have some idea for target average size, you want to target the largest trays that get turned all day, every day. And then you can figure out, well, just for assembly, how much time are we going to save? We know that on average, and this is just on average, it takes 12 seconds per instrument to assemble a tray. So if you cut a tray by 10 instruments, that's 120 seconds times, maybe that thing gets assembled 10 times a day. That's now 1,200 seconds you're saving in assembly. Over the course of a week, that's real time savings just from assembly. So really important to have those pieces of data. How many instruments are in the tray? How many times does this get assembled every day? How many copies of this do you have? And how many days of the week do we see this assembly on? Because it may be something that you turn 10 times on a Tuesday, but the rest of the week you don't use, right? So understanding those can give you the key pieces of information you need to make those projections for, okay, if we go and work this and burn these calories or invest in this tool that's going to help us do that, what realistically can we expect in terms of benefits, outcomes, things like that. So really helps in targeting those calories. But that is something that we're also looking at going forward. So we'll probably have lots more to talk about throughout the course of this year.
All right. in terms of instrument tracking, can you maybe highlight some common challenges when it comes to tracking the instruments? I mean, obviously it's learning these tracking systems, it's having a process, it's developing a workflow, but are there any other common challenges that you see?
Like a million. Uh, yeah,
How
I
about
think a
top
lot
three,
of,
maybe?
yeah, top three. Number one is process compliance, right? So it's how do you get people to do the right thing at the right time? Every facility has some set of processes that they've laid out for processing instrumentation. Um, and it's really important for sterilization, right? To consistently follow that process. Are you following the manufacturer's SOPs when you're cleaning the instruments? Are you doing proper inspections during assembly? Are you loading the sterilizer correctly and picking the right sterilization cycle every single time? So those are things that I think every department everywhere has to continually work at. Getting the data, having a tracking system enables you to actually monitor compliance with these processes. That's something you can't do manually, right? Um, so that's a challenge. I think the other challenges are delivering consistent, high quality instrumentation. That's something everybody has to work at all the time. Um, I'd say that the top three complaints from nurses are, stuff was missing from the tray when the count sheet said it was there, found a hole in the blue wrap, found a tray with a missing indicator, or occasionally bioburden, right? So figuring out how do you eliminate those sorts of mistakes, or how do you reduce those defect rates? That's number two. And then staffing continues to be a challenge for everybody everywhere in sterile processing. And that's sort of core to instrument tracking. At the end of the day, it's people that matter, right? Without the people, without the technicians, without the managers and the leaders in the department, none of this stuff happens. And when I talk to customers, I'm always amazed at how much stuff they're asked to do all day, every day, beyond just processing trays. So that is, again, another place where a tracking system can help out. It can improve productivity, and then it can give you the data to, show on paper, here's all the stuff that our department does that you're asking us to do. And this is why we're asking for the number of FTEs we're asking for. One example is, sometimes you'll get crash carts that get processed in sterile processing. Sometimes they're processed in materials. Those take a long time to process. 45 minutes or so is not unheard of. So being able to, show on paper, here's how much time we spend on these crash carts, either staff for it or move it back to materials, can be a very effective way to have that conversation. Whereas if you don't have the data, it's like, well, you're asking me to do crash carts and that takes forever. And your boss is like, great, what's forever? How long is that? What do we need to, staff for that? Well, I don't know, but it's a lot, right? That's a much more difficult and less effective conversation to have.
Right. Well, I think that that's a perfect way to end your session. Seamus, thank you so much once again.